Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Creating Spaces, Performing Arts in Sacred Places. I'm Kristen Johnson, Local Arts Advancement Program Manager with Americans for the Arts. We've got a great program planned for you today, and I'm excited to introduce our speaker. But first, a couple of quick reminders. First, ArtsU is our e-learning platform offering a variety of training options to support your work in the field. Be sure to visit artsu.americansforthearts.org to view more upcoming events. Second, there will be time for questions towards the second half of the presentation. However, feel free to type any questions that you may have in the moment into the chat box on the lower left-hand side of your screen at any time. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Karen DiLossi. As Director of Arts in Sacred Places, Karen has built and brought to a national stage a program that connects artists and congregations and also engages multiple civic, nonprofit, and funder stakeholders. Over the last 8 years, she has expanded this originally Philadelphia-based program into Chicago, Austin, and Baltimore. Starting this summer, Karen will begin piloting the program in New York City. Karen has also led the research report Creating Spaces, which elevated the artist space crisis conversation nationwide, and in the spring of 2016 opened the Philadelphia Design Center, the first of its kind in the country. Just this May, she produced Grounds That Shout, a series of performances curated by Reggie Wilson, where the artists performatively respond to religious spaces with a focus on the history of the Black and people of color religious experiences in Philadelphia and the United States. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Karen. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day in June. Thank you so much, Kristen, for the introduction and for plowing through that Grounds That Shout intro. I know it's a mouthful. I had to say it a number of times myself. So without further ado, first, I just want to say thank you to those of you in attendance now, and thank you to those who will be listening later. I will be happy to answer any and all questions at any time. Thank you also to our funder, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. They were really the reason why we were able to do all of this important work and do this study, so I want to make sure I tip my hat to them as well. So, Creating Spaces, Performing Artists in Sacred Spaces. So we did this study in Austin, Texas, Baltimore, Maryland, and Detroit, Michigan. How we picked the 3 cities. We picked the 3 cities based on geographic diversity. We picked them on a stated interest. So in all 3 of these cities' cases, I had been there previously and had seen some folks, artists and sacred places, and they connected with them, and they had a genuine interest in kind of learning more. So that was number 3, these previous in-person visits, and a willing cultural partner. I cannot express how important it was to have a cultural partner within that region to help support the work. I was never interested in being the person flying in from Philadelphia and telling people from a specific region about their region. I wanted a definite local person to really guide me through that process. I think that that is very important to have that regional focus. So our willing cultural partners were the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, the Austin Creative Alliance, and Culture Source, which is based in Detroit. First, I wanted to start off a little bit about partners. We can be a bit of an enigma in terms of, especially the cultural community, but we were founded in 1989. We're a non-sectarian, non-denominational, national nonprofit dedicated to the sound stewardship and active community use of the country's older historic religious properties. We're not associated with any specific faith practice at all. And we do have our roots in kind of that arts and architecture, heritage, preservation community. So really, the Arts in Sacred Places as a program is more of a community catalyst. So using sacred places as the starting focal point to create change, to create investment, to create new life within a particular neighborhood. So that's a little bit about partners, and we're national, so we kind of work everywhere, but we've had offices in Philadelphia, Chicago, and in Fort Worth, Texas, but we work really across the country. So the Making Homes for Arts and Sacred Places, I thought it would be great for you to have a snapshot of the program in general. So the program was started in 2011, and I am stationed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So Philadelphia is the recipient of a lot of our kind of laboratory work and a lot of our experimentation. So Grounds That Shout being an amazing example of that when Kristen had mentioned it earlier. So it was piloted in Philadelphia and then expanded to Chicago. And since I had to kind of refurbish a lot of this work for this presentation, I can actually add Austin and Baltimore to the two other cities that we've done the Arts and Sacred Places work. To date, we've done 55 total arts sacred place matches. These are matches that are either long-term, they're recurring, short-term. They run the gamut in terms of the length of the partnerships. But all of them are based in a foundation of mission and vision alignment and making sure that the artists and the congregations are really see one another as an extension of each other's mission. So they're not really on parallel tracks so much as working together. The space uses include performance, rehearsal, office, storage, build space, kind of you name it, and I've worked on it. So it's not just performance or exhibition space as you might kind of automatically go to, but it's really those supporting spaces that artists need to create their work that has really become central to what the Arts and Sacred Places program has done. And I just did these numbers as of the end of May, this past May, that's only a few days ago. We have interviewed over 175 artists or arts organizations that are interested in this program, and that's not just in Philadelphia, that's across the country. And I've also interviewed over 140 sacred places. So that's just folks that call me, email me, want to learn more, want to tell me about what their particular programs are, what their needs are. So, and those are mostly just me doing those. So that's quite a bit since 2011, and something I'm very proud of. So this research, we wanted to create, obviously, a framework for it. And do the artists have a need for space? What do they currently live with? And can the congregations solve the problem? Are there spaces within sacred places that will fit the bill in terms of what the artists are looking for in terms of space? So that was kind of the hope, is that the artists would need it and that the congregations would be able to have it. So we did this through a number of different ways. We started with the performing artists, and we had these town hall meetings in each city. So to introduce ourselves and introduce what the project was, and to invite them to fill out online surveys, which was the second thing. We really wanted to make the online surveys easy to fill out. I wanted to collect good quantitative data so that we would be able to create a report that was really rich. And I didn't want people to fill out half the survey and then not fill out the other half because there were too many short answer or essay questions. We use a lot of Likert item scale, judge this from 1 through 5, satisfied, dissatisfied, so that we can really kind of get an attitude in terms of where people are mentally with their space and with their needs. So onto the qualitative data, the very last question on the online surveys was, would you participate in a focus group? So folks that were interested in participating in a focus group, we had a few days of focus group sessions that people could attend, some in the morning, some at lunchtime, even 1 or 2 in the evening, so that we really, again, we're trying to make this as accessible as possible for people to attend. And that's where we really got the stories. That's where we really got the qualitative data, the things that really kind of hit home in terms of how the needs are more than just a number, how it really does impact the artists and their work. So the historic sacred places, we did structured interviews, as it says on the slide right there. We have an inventory system that takes about 90 minutes to 2 hours per congregation, per sacred place to do. And what we're collecting is we're measuring all of the physical interiors and the physical assets of the space. And I don't just mean the sanctuaries or the actual worship site. I'm talking about gymnasiums, educational wings, fellowship halls, really running the entire gamut. The other thing that we're measuring in those interviews, those 2-hour-long interviews with the sacred spaces, is what is their value set and how does that value set match up with potential artists who would like to be in that space. So again, we're really trying to match an artist value set with a sacred places value set. Now, in terms of this, I throw the term artist and sacred place around a lot. So just to give you a definition of those, for artists, we focused just on performing artists for a number of different reasons. But the most practical reasons was that they had more in common in terms of space needs and space wants. So we really wanted to hone in terms of how we could impact a particular, the performance field. And also, when I talk about, and when we talk about artists as well, it means arts organizations, it means individual artists, it means collectives, it means nonprofit and for-profit. So again, running the full gamut. For sacred place, that will mean church, a synagogue, a mosque, a worship site, as long as it is at least 50 years old and a purpose-built worship site, that's what we considered a sacred place. And that's within Partner's own mission. So that's kind of where that was coming from as well. So those are kind of the two things that we wanted to, that I want to make sure you understand in terms of definition. So we, in the end, were able to survey 233 artists. Now, these are, so you can see that they come from a number of different performative disciplines, dance, theater, music. Anybody that was multidisciplinary was kept in there if one of the disciplines was performative. Anybody who was just visual artist space was dropped from this particular study because we really wanted to make sure that we were impacting a certain field. And visual artists just needing many different types of spaces and many different assets and amenities, it was a little too difficult for us to lump them in with the performers. So, as you can see, Detroit's numbers are overall lower, and that is going to be just indicative of a different story and a different journey that Detroit has in this whole study. So when we were in Baltimore folks and Baltimore artists and churches, they themselves were convinced that we were going to find the same things in Detroit that we found there. And, we were very surprised when that was actually incorrect. So just to look at Detroit and to know that there's more to be investigated there. But as you can see, we really did run the gamut. And the folks in Austin, those high numbers tell a very specific story as well. So in terms of affiliation, this also just shows you the breadth of folks that we talk to. Individual artists making up a large portion of it, as well as nonprofit organizations making up a large portion of it in all 3 cities. We did talk to some for-profit organizations as well, and these multi-artist cooperatives or collectives, which definitely, while not the largest group, is definitely something that we're seeing more and more of across the country. So generally speaking, this program is going to be good for those small and emerging nonprofits and arts groups. But I will say this much, is that larger markets and organizations may also benefit from this kind of services as well, in terms of if you're a larger organization and you're looking for an annex space or facility for say, outreach or education, using a sacred place may be a good solution for that, rather than you acquiring more space and becoming yet a facility manager for yet a larger facility. So that's kind of a framing out the performing artists that we interviewed. So the next one is the results from our online survey. And I have to say these numbers really, I was expecting high numbers. I don't know if I was expecting numbers this high. So it was really shocking. The first number that artists see a need for more space is not shocking probably to anybody on the line right now. As a matter of fact, you're probably thinking to yourself, shouldn't that be 99.9? I know, having worked in the arts since the entirety of my career, space was always something that was needed. And in my previous position as a program director for an art service organization, that was one thing I was never able to provide was space, even though I would investigate different options and provide avenues for it. It was never something that could come to fruition, versus this program, which I'm able to service multidisciplines and all across the country. So the need for artists was critical to dire in nature, as you can see from that 96.2%. So the other numbers that I think are interesting to look at is that the brand or your image could be enhanced from being in a historic space. So that 84.5% people felt like a historic sacred place could potentially enhance the experience of their work, and even 69.1% feeling that it could enhance their brand, so who they are as artists. And the willingness to work with sacred places was overwhelmingly positive. So, when you have 89.9 seeing a home space as critical, and then 84% of those are receptive to associating their work with a historic sacred place, that really says a lot in terms of the positive nature that these relationships could take on. So overall, the artists are really setting a stage that is for a positive growth for it to happen. Then we have the focus groups. The focus groups were amazing. I met such great artists who have such dire needs. But the needs from the artists was completely clear. They need a home space 1,000 times over. They need artistic freedom. That was something that obviously I certainly wouldn't want them to bend on. And they need assistance finding their potential home. That assistance finding the home is so tough. Having seen and worked in all levels of nonprofit arts, when you're doing everything yourself, from producing and marketing to company management, finding a space, and maybe even doing your own lights and sound, it can be a lot to try and find these spaces where you're just looking to create your work. So those were definitely the takeaways from and the themes from all of our focus groups in all 3 cities. So I have some really great quotes from these artists, and we could only pick out 3, but I would love to just read these. We'd be able to produce work that is much more based on the community's input, because we wouldn't be nomadic. We'd have a more stable audience because we'd be more stable. That's from someone in Baltimore. And then in Austin, as an artist, I would like to be totally shackle-free, and I shouldn't be worried I'm going to offend someone else's beliefs. So all 3 of these quotes are really tacking on to those 3 themes. And lastly, from Detroit, I mean, we could get so much stuff done and accomplished if a program existed. That would be just like a dream come true. So really, they're putting into words those 3 themes from the previous slide. I could probably go back and forth between the 2, and you would easily make the connection. So that is what the artists were telling us. For the historic sacred places, the results were really consistent. Sacred places have the space to share, frankly. They want a link to the community. They want to have their doors open and have the community using their spaces as a resource. And they will provide artistic freedom. So what's really interesting in this whole study and in my work in general, being an artist myself and kind of coming from that world, is that the perception isn't the reality. And it's definitely this battle between perception versus reality. And I find that I'm constantly correcting those perceptions. In Texas, especially, the artists were very keen on having artistic freedom, which I can understand, being in an area that maybe they felt as though it was not, that they weren't allowed to have that freedom as much. But what was surprising is that the churches in Austin, and they were all churches in this circumstance, the churches in Austin were probably the most open out of all the three cities. So the artist's perception of how the congregations might react to their work was not the reality. So, so there were really limited concerns about artistic content there from the congregation side. And I have 3 quotes from them as well. We don't really have the infrastructure to mount things ourselves, but I see great potential for partnership. To create vibrancy, we see the cultural arts as part of that mix. That's a congregation leader in Baltimore. In Austin, we want to be a convener of culture and conversation to open the larger community to interact. So really wanting those doors to be open in Austin. And then in Detroit, artists can provide an educational opportunity to our community. So really seeing what the value is. So here's a really knockout slide. So when we look at the amount of space. So this is a list of the physical space within all 3 cities. There is a ton of space. And those spaces were in overall better condition than what those artists could afford in commercial real estate that they currently use. So in other words, the spaces were they lent themselves much more to their art form and were just in better shape and safer for them as artists to be in. And what I want people to focus in on is that these numbers, these square footage numbers, are only from 6 sacred places in each region. So there were actually more that volunteered. So in Baltimore, that 42,466 square feet was only from 6 facilities in Baltimore. I actually had 24 congregations that volunteered to be a part of this study. In Austin, I had 19 total that volunteered. But out of the 6, I got 72 plus thousand square feet in Austin. Everything's just bigger in Texas. And then in Detroit, I actually had 15 congregations volunteer. But out of the 6, I had 18,000 square feet of footage that is unused or underused. Some that could be used exclusively for performing artists, and others that it could be used on a semi-regular basis that would be shared with the congregation. But it's a total just from 18 different facilities across the 3 cities. It's a total of over 133,000 square feet that is available for artists to use. So this slide is always one I like to take a little more time to kind of let that sit in there because it's a lot of unused or underused square footage. So we understand that regions have their own uniqueness, and when we were looking through this, it seemed as though each one was a different laboratory of sorts. So just focusing in a little bit on each one. In Austin, we're talking about a growth laboratory. The population is exploding in Austin. They cannot handle the influx of folks that want to move into the city limits. Keeping Austin weird is going to be difficult if their artists can't afford space to rehearse or space to live. And that's what's happening right now in Austin. I've been going to Austin since 2012. And when I went there in the beginning, if I stayed somewhere that was on the north side of the city, I'd have to drive from the airport through the city, and it usually wasn't a problem. And towards the end of this study and our phase 2 work, I would actually stay in the south of the city so I wouldn't have to drive through. That's how busy it was. So just this rapid population growth in the real estate market. There was a woman who had a rehearsal space, and because of the real estate boom, when her lease came up, the landlord decided to cash in and charge her double or triple what her rent used to be. So she was practicing in her backyard, and that's for as long as her house lease was, because the artists tend to be renters of their home space as well. So Austin is about growth. For Baltimore, it was really about community. The artists that came to our focus groups and the artists that answered our online surveys all wanted to be serving and working in their own neighborhoods. They wanted to be able to walk out their door, walk a few blocks, and get to where they were going. But what they're finding there is that they have high rent for insufficient spaces or inadequate spaces. There'd be people paying high rent for concrete floors when they're trying to do dance, or they're paying no rent, but they have to get to an area of town that has poor public transportation. And in one case, once they got there, they had to move gym equipment to rehearse or perform, and then when they were done, move it back. So at what point is that space free anymore? So that's kind of where Baltimore is. It's really about community and how can the community work together and how can these artists work in their community. Then in Detroit, again, the journey of Detroit is DIY spaces, like doing it themselves. I probably had about 5 different artists come to our focus groups that were in the process of buying or had already bought a sacred place, a church with surrounding land, and we're hoping that I could tell them what they could be doing with it and how they could do it themselves. It's happening so fast, and that the funders in Detroit don't even know where the next pocket of activity is going to be happening in Detroit. And they're doing it, the artists are doing it to great personal debt, and it's all self-funded. So finding out, how to better serve that community is really what's happening in Detroit, given the vast amounts of population change and what their community wants to focus on. And the other sites that they have there that the artists were performing in were frankly dangerous, with leaky roofs and frayed wires that, the artists it's no surprise that they're kind of trying to buy things themselves and create a better place to perform for themselves. So with these laboratories, there's certainly, just to expand on that a little bit, to add to their identities, I just want to point to some specific numbers that my research partner and I were able to dig up. So in Austin, to look at this number, the population change since 2010 is 15.5%. I wouldn't be surprised if Austin was in one of the top 10 cities by the time we hit the 2020 census to see what that population change really is. But that's a really high number. They're going to be above 1 million for sure. I feel positive about that. So the growth laboratory continues. In Baltimore, just pointing at this percentage in poverty, this 23.8%, knowing that artists may be living in some of these more low-rent districts and wanting to provide arts or to engage with their local community in the arts, I think would really help this particular percentage of the population if we can open up some of these congregational spaces for them to use. In Detroit, if the median home value is $50,000, why not buy it and try to do it yourself? So it kind of really, all of these numbers really kind of blend back into the laboratories that we were able to unearth in terms of what is going on in these 3 cities and how their regions are reacting to artists living in their world. So we have the findings and we've identified the need. So the problem is that artists lack a home space to develop their art form and to just connect and do their work, to just do the work. So how can we give them opportunities? The other thing with historic sacred places is that they have the memberships are going down, but there is a small group of people that want to stay within the space, and they want to dedicate it to the community as a resource. So we have these giant facilities with only a few members that are actually taking care of the facilities. So how can these two work together? What is the opportunity there? The opportunity, what it needs is human and physical, human capital, physical capacity, all of that, which is basically folks to help bring them together, but also the physical spaces, like, you know, caring for these spaces. If a space is left abandoned and no one is left to look after it, care for it, or just be in the space noticing when a small leak is a small leak before it's a big leak, you know, you need folks in the space and using all the spaces in order to really be caring for all of those physical needs, especially when you're talking about congregational spaces that are just so big. And if you have a small membership, those members aren't going to be in all these different facilities. But if you have artists using them, it's in a way already taking care of it, because the artist will notice when something goes awry in a certain area because it's affecting their work and everything else. So it's really a symbiotic relationship in that way. So the impact, you know, artists, if they're able to get in these spaces, they can engage with their communities, they can advance their art form without worrying about where they're going to rehearse tomorrow or next week, or where they're going to perform tomorrow or next week, and help build sustainable careers. Because generally, the congregations, I'm not going to say 100%, own these facilities. So the rents that artists might pay are generally below market because the congregations are looking to cover their utilities and maintenance costs, which they don't have that added mortgage cost on top of it. So it can definitely be something that can make it much more sustainable for an artist, aside from the fact that then the artist doesn't have to be a facility person. It doesn't have to care for the building. The congregation is there to care for the building. For the sacred places, they can become vital community centers. They can really start to impact their community, because now people are coming through the doors. The more people are coming through the doors, the more value it has for the community. And they're going to be providing relevant programs. And really, both of these, you know, the artists and the sacred places are working towards mutual benefit and sustainability. A successful impact model is going to create those two things. It's going to create mutual benefit. It's going to create sustainability, because each one is really providing the other with something that is wanted and needed for each other. So that's kind of where the impact is. So what is Partners Program Model? So when it comes down to it, the key element is this human capacity needed to accomplish what can be a really daunting task for an already strapped administrative staff. And when I say an already strapped administrative staff, I mean that in terms of the sacred place, and I mean that in terms of the artist. Both of them may be working to capacity. So is there a way for an outside organization to kind of come in and help to shepherd that process and nurture that process when the part-time or overworked staff really can't do that? So how can we do that? And Partners has a replicable, scalable model that we can deliver to different regions based on that region's wants and needs and you know, things that they would like to have and see. So our model has two phases. One is really a readiness assessment. So basically, if phase one doesn't pan out, then phase two won't apply. So phase one is us figuring out is what we're able to provide, is it something that would work for your community, for your society, for your artists, for your congregations? Because if it doesn't work out, then you know you should be finding assistance elsewhere. And at the very least, our phase one work, that research piece, will really kind of help you figure that out. And particularly when I talk about Detroit, I mean, in the end, if you notice, when I'm talking about where we are now, I mentioned that we are in Austin, we are in Baltimore, but we're not in Detroit. And that's mostly due to the fact of what we were able to discover and unearth in this study is that what Detroit needs isn't necessarily something that we had to provide for them, something that we felt capable of providing to them. What they need is, you know, kind of a lot of planning and a lot of other pieces, programmatic pieces that we don't have available. But for Austin and Baltimore, they had a lot more in common. So that's why that phase one is so important. So we're looking to replicate research efforts that we did in those 3 cities in other regions. So it determines the readiness and how ready you are for a program like ours. And then we can initiate phase 2 or conclude activities as we did in Detroit. So phase 2 is really about implementation. So, you know, we can provide national oversight and program delivery. We partner with local service providers that would manage the operations to implement the program. Ideally, a 3-year intervention process per region is what would be optimal. I think that 3 years in gives you a chance to engage with the appropriate number of artists and the appropriate number of sacred places. It gives you a chance to bring partnerships together. A lot of this, it's not an overnight process. I have helped to nurture partnerships and bring partnerships to fruition, some of which in 3 months, some of which in 9 months. So some of these things just take time to bring together because it's about finding, you know, the right match. So this implementation piece is something that we were able to do in Austin and Baltimore as a result of our phase 1 work. Program components, these are the foundation of our program. One is investing in human capital. So that's program coordination and administration. It's all of those things that seem like extra back burner items to either the congregation or the artist. We can bring it to the front burner and we can do that. Collaborating with local arts service organizations is, I can't express enough how much I don't want to be the person to fly in and solve your problems. Like, I want folks on the ground in that region to be able to do it themselves. So really kind of that collaboration is key, which leads me to the next point of training the trainer model. So really kind of having the local arts service organization be the one to kind of shepherd this in the future to be able to find what's best for their region. What is your region? What kind of laboratory is it? What is the model that you have going in your region that needs to be addressed? And the local folks are going to be the ones that are doing that. Another part of the program model is collecting what the needs are, the physical assets, the attitudinal assets, or rather attitudinal value set of both the sacred places and the artists, and figuring out how they can best work together. And then retaining pro bono services. I know that I've been very lucky to have legal pro bono services, so if there's a lease being developed, I have a real estate attorney who helps develop those and create those. So everything in this program model is filling in that empty space where there was a lack of human capacity. So continued efforts and next steps. We were very lucky to have been able to present our study findings from Austin, Baltimore, and Detroit in various settings, both in New York, in Chicago, and Minneapolis. And this webinar is a part of that effort as well, because I want people to understand that the need is not going away, and it's something that needs to be definitely addressed. We did secure funding for implementation for phase 2 in both Austin and Baltimore. So I was really excited to be able to go back to those 2 cities and to then take some of this information and address it. So it was really good to have Detroit as a little bit of an outlier in that respect. So phase 2 in Detroit, as it says on the slide, requires further investigation. So kind of having this third city not really fit the same model as the other 2 is helpful, because then we know maybe there's something else for a place like that that requires further investigation, and how could that be addressed in a future iteration or in a phase 3 or 2.0. And then where I'm going to be initiating phase 1 in Brooklyn and Manhattan specifically, focusing in on 2 boroughs of New York City, kind of collecting the physical assets of certain spaces, sacred places up there, in terms of how they could interlock with the dance community. And I do have 2 partners up there. I have Dance NYC as well as New York Landmarks. So I'm very excited to have both of those on board as partners as I go into New York City, because I really want to make sure that that the New York artists and the New York sacred places know that I'm being, a collaborator with people that they know and trust. So that is really kind of the end of my presentation, and I hope that this was helpful. I can leave this slide up so that it has my email address on there and my phone number if folks have questions. So I see there is one from Jenny. How do we contact these artists to let them know that our facility is available? That is a really great question. So I'm assuming that Jenny is with a congregation. And what I would say is that for that, there's a number of different resources that you could put in place. I know that Fractured Atlas, which is a national nonprofit as well, arts-related nonprofit, they have space finders in a lot of cities. So if you just Google space finder and the name of your city, you might be able to find it, or some other kind of space finder tool. And you can post on there for free your space, the dimensions of your space, photos of your space, what times it's available, the rental amount you would like to collect. And now that is primarily for short-term space use. So you might get a lot of one-time space users. You might also get people from, say, the corporate world who are looking to have a different space for their event. So that's one way to kind of be able to tackle that. In terms of other ways to know that your facility is available, contacting your local art service organization and letting them know, and they might have some ways to figure that out. You can also, I'm more than happy to answer that, in a separate conversation, because it can kind of go on and on depending. So feel free to shoot me an email, Jenny. I'm more than happy to answer that question in specific to where you are. So, so there's another question here. If I've found that arts groups kind of quote unquote gave back to the sacred spaces in terms of custodial or management, or was it just rent? And the answer is that no 2 relationships are alike, and what is given and what is received is different in each specific case. So it could be that the artist, if it is applicable, they may be giving the church or sacred place some sort of service in exchange for rent. I will say most cases that I've worked with myself, probably 90% of them have been money for space. There may be times where that rent amount has been reduced because the artist took out some specific costs to upgrade the space or in some way to improve the facility. So that money was taken off of the rent, but in most cases they are paying rent. Another question, surprised to hear that I've not encountered content issues with arts groups. There are, so what I will say is this, is that there are content issues. What it really is, it's about the artist being honest with what their content is. So what do you do in your work? And just to focus on the big obvious things, is there, do people take off their clothes? Is there bad language, or what is the subject matter? So there are content-related issues in terms of these partnerships. I think it's a matter of asking for permission, not for forgiveness. So to really make sure that as an artist, you're being upfront with your work, and that's why that mission and vision, which I only kind of touched on, and I'm actually going to talk more about that in the second webinar, is really, really important, so that you're being very upfront with what it is your work and why you're doing it. So, so the content does matter, and again, this was just reinforced just this past week when I was doing a site visit at another congregation. When I asked them about content, they were more concerned with the content somehow belittling a certain group of people, or frankly kind of putting hateful rhetoric. They were much more concerned with that than kind of the things that might kind of first come to mind. So that is kind of where I am with that. I can't see this last question at the bottom, kind of cut off a little bit. But just to talk a little bit about I can talk a little bit about the content issues just a little bit more. You should know what it is that you're doing within a space, and to know that if you explain why you're doing what you do in a way that makes sense to the congregation, generally I've seen that there's been no issues. Again, asking for permission. Another question here. I mentioned Phase 2 in Austin. Their congregation is in Austin. How do they participate? Jenny, I will ask you to definitely write me an email, kDiLossi@sacredplaces.org. I would love to answer your question offline. So, and I'm getting a message from Kristen that the second webinar will be in a follow-up email. So that second one is really where we get into that content question. We get into what are the things you need to consider before partnering with a congregation or with an artist. So really kind of what are those, what are the top things that you need to consider as an artist or as a congregation before you jump in the deep end of a relationship with the other one, so that it really can be more of a relationship and a partnership rather than a landlord-tenant situation. So, and because both groups are generally mission-based, it tends to be something that's very important, that it's not just a piece of paper and you sign it and you pay rent on a certain date. So thank you, Kristen, for that reminder. And I think everybody would love to get a follow-up email about the date for that. That will be in July. There's a lot of traveling and things like that, vacationing that are happening between now and then. It seems as though there aren't any other questions. So I want to thank everybody for listening, both now and in the future, and to know that I check my email frequently and to get all kinds of random emails and phone calls from folks all across the country. So I'm happy to talk to everyone that emails me or calls me.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you for everybody that attended today's Creating Spaces, Performing Arts in Sacred Places webinar. It's actually a really fun one to say. So just a quick reminder that we are actually recording this webinar, and the recording will be available in about 24 to 48 hours for you to check out the replay on. As Karen just mentioned, we'll send out a reminder to you. Oh, we actually have one more question before I totally wrap this up. So Karen, Julie is actually wondering if you're planning to go to any other communities.
Yes. As I mentioned, we did get, so all of this is funding based. So we have to find generally a regional funder who is looking to do the research and the work to bring people together. So we were very lucky. We received a grant from the New York Community Trust. And so we're going to be going to Manhattan and Brooklyn, working to find historic sacred places, of which there are a lot, that we can bring artists into that area. especially dance artists specifically, and that has a lot to do with the fact that Dance NYC is our main partner. So that's why we're focusing in on dance. And I have folks from the San Francisco Bay Area. I have been to the Bay Area like once for a separate project, not relating to this. I have spoken to folks at Theater Bay Area, which is a local arts service organization in the Bay Area. So I never quite got down the line of talking to a regional funder, although I would love to do that. So Christine, I see you're on the line. If you want to email me to talk about that further, I'm always looking to explore new regions of the country because I know that there are more that need this kind of work, and it's just really a matter of having folks that have a willingness and having a funder that is willing to fund it. And I see Julie, you said you're in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're actually doing a lot, partners in general is doing a lot in North Carolina, as in the whole state, actually. I don't have funding for the arts yet in any part of North Carolina, but again, just like Christine, please feel free to email me so we can start a dialogue. That's usually how these things start. It starts with me having a conversation with one or two artists or with a local arts service organization, as I mentioned, Theater Bay Area, as I mentioned, Dance NYC, and then it goes from there. So if you're interested in having this come to your region for at least a conversation, that's usually the first place to start, is just emailing me or giving me a call so we can figure out what may be the best way to do that, and I can even get our development director on the line to talk about that.
It looks like you have some prospects for your next cities now. That's exciting. Okay, let me give actually just one last final call for any questions before we close things out. Okay, I think we're clear. If you think of any other questions, after we close out, feel free to email Karen. As you can see, her email is on the screen there. It sounds like she would love to hear from all of you. Again, just a reminder that we are recording this. So it'll be available for replay in about 24 to 48 hours. As Karen mentioned, what I'm going to do is when the recording is available, I will actually send out an email to all of you letting you know that the recording is available, and I will include the link to the July webinar, the follow-up one that she's doing, so that way you can join us for that one as well. But in the meantime, be sure to visit us at artsu.americansforthearts.org to view other training opportunities and resources. And thank you again, everyone.